So welcome, John Dehlin. Nice to have you here.
Thanks. Thanks, cross-examiner. Do I refer to you as the cross-examiner?
You can call me the cross-examiner. You can call me Graham. You can call me Hey You, however
All
you
right.
like to do it.
Hey,
That would be
Graham.
good with me. Thanks.
Thanks for having me on your show, and thanks for being on my show.
100%. I'm really glad that I reached out to you. I'm really glad that you offered to have us release this on both of our shows. I think both of our listeners would really benefit from this conversation of me getting to know you and your work and your journey through your belief system. So I really do appreciate it. You are, by all means, a very, very busy individual. So I appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to give my listeners a little bit of a background and correct me if I'm wrong. So you are a former member of the Church of Latter-day Saints. People will call them Mormons or Church of Latter-day Saints. My Mormon friends call themselves LDSers all the time. How do you prefer to refer to your former belief?
The church's official name is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's really a handful. A believing Mormon would say the Jesus Christ is the most important part, so you don't want to leave that out. The Latter-day Saints is just Joseph Smith's spin on the name, and it's meant to sort of remind us all that Jesus is coming soon. And the church was founded in 1830, and it took a few years. They changed the name a few times along the way, but that's the name we settled with.
Gotcha. Okay, that's great to know. And you are now, first of all, you hold a PhD in psychology, and you do this podcast that we're doing a dual episode on called Mormon Stories. We're going to get to how you got there and all of that sort of stuff, but you also do other blogs and websites that I saw. In my reading, I identified you as somebody who was very influential in the early sort of Mormon blogosphere movement. And as far as I can tell, your current practice focuses on dealing with issues of either being in a high demand religion or being LGBTQ within any sort of religion, and maybe even coming out or leaving the religion, those sorts of things. Am I describing sort of your focus correctly now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I started out, I was raised Mormon. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but I started the podcast back in 2005 just to help people be able to talk about things that they couldn't talk about at church. And over time it's grown. So yeah, Mormon Stories podcast. And we're all about long form and just letting Mormons tell their stories.
Absolutely. I have watched many episodes. I started, the episode that brought me in was Eve's story, a couple of episodes about a young lady named Eve. You and your co-host sat her down and she volunteered to discuss some little known facts about Mormonism, which we'll get to later. And then she volunteered to be filmed while you told her this, and you could sit there and watch her process this information that she obviously hadn't heard, or maybe heard in the whispers in the winds, but was now hearing it from a fairly trusted source. And those two videos, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. To watch somebody deal with this information from a trusted source in real time was really moving. And I really felt for her. I really loved how you approached it, very gently, but fact-based. So that got me down a rabbit hole of following what you were doing, and watched a lot of those videos. And your viewership is speaking volumes. You've got hundreds of thousands of people that subscribe now. What does it feel like to be at this point where people are listening to you talk to people as they deal with these Mormon-related issues?
It's super fun. And I just have to give a shout out to my friend, Cara Burrell. She runs a YouTube channel called Nuance Ho.
Yep.
And that particular interview was on Cara's Nuance Ho channel. And she's gotten hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million views from that one single episode. I tried to get Cara to let me put it on Mormon Stories. She's like, no. But
that's hers.
It's really rewarding. We started out audio only back in 2005, and we probably were audio only for a good 5 to 10 years. And then we just started recording the video on Zoom, just kind of like to have it. But it's only been kind of since right before COVID that we started just consciously trying to grow our YouTube audience. So this week we passed 250,000. And, for many YouTube channels, that's small beans, but for the Mormon specific circles, 250,000 is a huge number. So it's humbling, and I'm really grateful. And weirdly, something like 60% of my YouTube audience has never been Mormon. So weirdly, there's a huge appetite for Mormon stories that extends well beyond active believing faithful Mormons or even ex-Mormons. So that's fun.
Absolutely. I am one of those people. My background is I was never really religious. Early in my life, I would have answered the question, do you believe in God, with a yes. But fairly early in my teens, I think I would have started answering with a no, and my parents were not very religious. So, and I am a huge fan of Mormon Stories and Nuance Ho, and see who wrote the book. I forget her name. Alyssa Grenfell, I think you've talked to, that wrote this book. She's wonderful as well, and I'm watching all of this content, and we can sort of probably discuss later why the never-Mormons is such a huge audience. I think I have some ideas there. But getting back to you, the big event then in your life was in 2015. You were excommunicated from the church. So I think what my listeners are going to be interested in hearing is your journey from being in the church to having some sort of crisis of faith to the point where you leave the church, not necessarily by your own choice. So do you mind if I sort of walk through that history?
No, that'd be great. Go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So from an educational standpoint, let's start there just so people understand what you were doing with your profession. You have a bachelor's in poli-sci, and you got that in the early 90s at BYU. Is that correct?
Yeah, and let me just also just say that something that I think we both decided would be fun is to release this episode on both our platforms.
Yes.
Because my audience is used to me being the question asker, not the question answer. But I've got so many new listeners as of the past few years that I think they would enjoy just kind of like, who is this John guy? Let me know more about him. So every couple of years, I try and release an episode of someone interviewing me. And so that's kind of what's fun about today is, it'll be fun to kind of get to know your audience. Mm-hmm. And then and it's also fun for my audience to get to know you and also to hear my story as well. So I just
100%.
thought we'd throw that in there. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I'm excited about that. I'm fairly new to the podcasting, been doing it for a year or so. I am, for your audience, I am also a regular host now on several shows devoted to atheism and separation of church and state are my main focuses. I am an attorney, and that's my focus is pushing back against Christian nationalism taking over sort of the United States. So my main hosting job is this podcast, but also I'm a regular host now on The Atheist Experience, which has, 500,000 viewers as well. So we're in the same sort of order of magnitude of viewers. It's humbling to have that many people. I know that my audience over on that show will be very interested from hearing from you. So if we can ever arrange it, maybe we could have you come on as a guest and take some calls and talk to people.
That'd be super fun.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back. Where should we jump in?
Okay. So I just wanted to sort of get people in your mindset of what you do for a career before we jump into your beliefs. So
okay.
You had poli-sci in 93 at BYU, and then got a master's in instructional technology in 2007-ish. Is that correct?
Yeah. So weirdly, when I was at Brigham Young University, which is where I got my bachelor's degree, which is like Mormonism's Notre Dame, equivalent for the Catholics. Mm-hmm. I wasn't sure what to major in, and I kind of had an interest in politics, so I actually pursued political science, thinking that I would go to law school. But I actually also learned at BYU somehow that you should love what you do and be passionate about it. And don't be upset here. I talked to several of my lawyer friends, and none of them said they love what they do. And that was like a red flag for me. And I know that there are lawyers who love what they do, but it's just so happened the people that I talked to didn't love what they did. And so I'm like, well, I better wait. So I left BYU. I went to work for Bain & Company, which was Mitt Romney's management consulting firm. Mm-hmm. It's based in Boston, but I went to the Dallas office. And that's when the internet, like 1993, 94, that's when Netscape Navigator first starts coming out. And I learn about the internet, and I'm like, okay, management consulting is cool, but this internet thing is going to be big. So I moved, I left Bain after a year, went to Chicago to Arthur Anderson, and started doing internet consulting with the whole time, not internet consulting, sorry, computer programming consulting.
Mhm.
And the whole time I was thinking, I'll go teach school, I'll go be a principal at a school, but I just need to figure out what graduate degree to pursue. So tech kind of happened as an accident, as me just wanting to earn money for my family. So long story short, I spent a year at the Mormon Church as a tech consultant doing Y2K conversions. So during the year 2000 timeframe, around 98, everyone was freaking out that when year 2000 came along, all the computers were stopped working. So I actually spent a year at the Mormon Church consulting them, converting their databases from kind of legacy DOS-based databases into Windows-based, like Access-based databases.
Yep.
The coolest project I worked on at the LDS Church, it was a general authority tracking system. So they had a system that tracked who their future leaders might be, candidates for their future leadership, and they allowed me to be on that project, which was kind of fun to see what things they think about to choose their highest level leaders.
Sure.
And I'll just say I ended up at Microsoft in around 98, 99, and I was there around 7 years. And then that's where I lost my faith at Microsoft. And then when I left Microsoft, took about a year to figure out in grad school that podcasts were going to be a big thing. So by 2005, while I was in grad school studying instructional technology, I learned about podcasts and I started Mormon Stories. Then we're one of the longest running podcasts in the world. I'm told we're not the longest running, but since we started in 2005, I think we're at least close.
That is quite a story. And I think you and I have not talked about our histories until this moment. I am stunned at how parallel we are in our background. So let me just give you a quick version.
Yeah.
I majored in political science in the early 90s because I was thinking about going to law school.
Nice.
But I talked to people. I hope you're detecting a pattern here. You talked to people who were lawyers and they didn't seem too happy. And my father said, hey, you're going to get into a career where you have a high chance that every single day you're going to have to be making some moral decisions, some tough decisions. Are you sure you want that? So I drove myself back down to Charleston, South Carolina, where I was born and raised, sat on the beach and thought about what I wanted to do and decided I didn't want to go to law school yet. And I wanted to get into teaching and helping people, whatever I need to do to pay. I got a job at a medical records software company as a consultant, working on consulting for medical records software, and eventually worked myself up to be the co-manager of their Y2K conversion team. And I'm telling you, it gets better. Okay. So I managed people who were converting hospitals' software, their medical record software, from DOS, old DOS stuff into Windows stuff, old mainframe databases into Access databases or SQL databases. Same exact thing. And then eventually after that, internet came, I quit, and some friends of mine built a company, a small little company that was looking at the internet boom saying, well, this is a gold rush. I don't want to pan for gold. I want to sell the picks and shovels and the denim jeans. So we created a web company that would make you your website or do whatever you need, because we had developed this tech expertise. So I think we might be brothers from another mother or gone through some sort of portal. But yeah,
you weren't raised religiously at all, or were you? Okay.
None. I mean, my mother took us to church occasionally because I think she felt that was the right thing to do. But, the closest I came to religious upbringing was I was in school after I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, moved around because my dad was in the Navy. That's why we were there. I have no particular family ties to it, but there's a big Navy base there. We ended up back in Charleston when I started sort of my middle school to approaching high school years. And back then, this is the late 70s, early 80s, South Carolina schools were 49th in the nation, right above Mississippi. So they
Mm.
worked very hard to get us into a private school. You had to sort of test into it, but you also had to have, you could get some scholarships if your parents were in the military. So we scrimped and saved and got us in there. And that was a religious school. It was an Episcopalian
Oh, cool.
religious school.
Okay.
So I did do, I went to chapel. This was for many years, went to chapel. I was occasionally the person, putting out the candles and saying the lesson for the day. But for me, in that environment, it was just at that age a thing you did. There wasn't any truth claims being asserted to me. Like nobody was telling me this is literally true, and I sort of took it as these are interesting stories. I wonder why we're doing this. And for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week outside of chapel, there was no overt what you would imagine from maybe a traditional Catholic school where you have a nun teaching you and there's a crucifix on the wall. There was none of that, no trappings. It was just a nice school that also had chapel once a week.
Got it.
Yeah.
Fun. Well, those are fun parallels.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you then I want to jump back and start early on with your
absolutely. Yeah.
your religious beliefs, if you don't mind, and then we can jump back up to what you're doing now, because I think that's a good arc. So, you were, as we said, a Mormon. So, as you say on your show, I would love to hear your Mormon story, and I'm not sure where to start out. I think with my audience, we might want to start out like a good lawyer at the beginning of a contract or a law by defining some terms. If that's all right with you.
Sure.
All right. So what is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? What is that?
All right. Yeah. So and this history is going to be new to many Mormons, actually, ones that have only heard the official version. So I'll just warn people, everything I say, I believe is factually true and substantiated, but it will seem controversial or even scandalous to the average Mormon because you haven't been told your true history. So in the 1820s, there was a boy named Joseph Smith. He was born in Vermont, but he was raised kind of in a place called Palmyra, New York. He was a younger son of a pretty large family. They were pretty poor. They were pretty unsuccessful farmers, and they didn't love farming. So they got. You should also know that they were superstitious. They believed in folk magic, in magic artifacts, in dreams, and in visions. But they're also Christian. And during those 1820s time period, there were rumors of like buried treasure, that pirates or Native Americans had buried treasure all around kind of, let's just say, colonial United States, and that you could find it. And there was kind of a ruse that, or a scam that sort of, country folk would do if they were ambitious. And that would be to claim that they had the ability to see buried treasure in the ground and or to talk to spirits, because they believed that like dead pirates as spirits would guard the treasure. So the con was, if I can convince people I have the power to see underground and that I can communicate with spirits, then I can get money from them or get power and influence from them. And so that's how Joseph Smith sort of starts his Mormon story. He spends several years with his dad going around New York, Pennsylvania, and, as a treasure digger or as a scryer,
right?
Or they're different words, scryer, peeper, glass looker. And it turns out this was all illegal. So,
sure. Fraud at a minimum. If you know you're lying, if you say something is false in order to induce somebody to pay you, that's the definition of fraud.
Yeah. And there were laws on the books. And if you go back even to Benjamin Franklin in the mid to late 1700s, he has this quote where he's like, man, this is a problem. I can't believe these people are doing these things. Well, that's how Joseph Smith got his start. And weirdly, he never found any treasure, but he did make money. But he had this power to convince people that he had special powers and he would take a stone and he would stick it in a hat and he would look in the hat and then he would tell people where the buried treasure would be. And every time they started digging and, they'd get close to it. And then he'd say, oh, you didn't kill the chicken right, or you didn't draw the pentagram right. And I'm making up those details, but there was always some reason why the people who were digging messed it up. And then the spirit would withdraw the treasure farther down. And then Joseph would say, oh, sorry, we're not going to be able to get it today, but it's there. And if you come back next time, pay me a little more money, I'm sure we'll be able to find it. And that was the thing. You're laughing. Why are you laughing?
No, I'm laughing because I think there's going to be a theme that we're going to see evolve here, because
100%.
that's a classic shifting the blame, right? That's what psychics do. That's what con artists do. It sounds like he was doing a mixture of dowsing. I can find the water underground and I can talk to spirits. So seances. And if I'm doing a cold reading, right, I'm trying to pretend like I'm John Edward who can speak to the dead. And I say, I'm getting a name. It starts with an A. Is there any A in your life? And you say no. And then I say B and you say no. And I say C and you say no. Eventually I'm going to go, you're resisting the things. I can't get through. You've got negative energy. It's all your fault. I can't guess a name out of your life. So this is going to be a thread, I think, as we go forward.
Yeah, the house always wins, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And so by 1826, 27, the law is onto him. He's being charged with breaking the law. There's at least one or two trials that go on in Pennsylvania or New York, and kind of the jig is up. But so he needs a new thing. But while he was in Pennsylvania, he boarded with this man named Isaac Hale, who had a cute daughter. And so he falls in love with Isaac's daughter, Emma. They elope because Isaac thinks he's a fraud, which, I think he thinks that with good reason. So he's not going to give Joseph permission to marry Emma. So they elope, they run away and get married. And eventually they end up, I think Isaac misses his daughter. So they end up coming back to Pennsylvania area. And he says that he comes up with this new story that an angel has visited him. And, the name changes from Nephi to Moroni, but he basically comes up with this new story that an angel has come to him and said, I'm an ancient Native American who died. I'm now in spirit. And I have this record of these people who were Native Americans, who actually were Jews, who came over on a boat from Israel around 600 BC, started civilizations, populated America, and then half of the group turned bad, and God cursed them all with dark skin as a curse for being bad. They were called Lamanites. The white good ones were called Nephites. And at the end, Jesus comes. He preaches the gospel. After Jesus dies over in the old world, he comes to America, visits the Native Americans, and then eventually the dark Christian Native Americans, actually, they probably weren't Christian by that point. They kill off all the white-skinned Christian Native Americans. And because they were, quote, savages, then they lost their Christianity. And so when the explorers came over, led by God, to America, the conquistadors and the pilgrims and whatever, God led them over here. They found the remnants of the Lamanites, which were the Native Americans, the Indian tribes. And so Joseph basically says, an angel's told me that he's going to give me gold plates. That's a religious record of these Native Americans. And then it's my job to translate those records. And the only problem is no one can see the gold plates. So I get to see them.
So I want to jump in here. That's first. I just want to sit in the seat of my audience right now. Yeah. I'm actually quite familiar with this part of the story. The fact that it opened with his fraudulent psychic treasure hunting was fairly new to me, but this part I'm fairly familiar with.
Okay,
but that's a lot to take in, right?
Yeah,
there's so many claims there that to quote the Book of Mormon musical, ancient Jews built boats and sailed to America.
That's right.
That's quite a claim, but that is literally, that's well documented as far as I can tell. When I'm starting to read up, I've got a lot of books I bought because of your show and other shows, but that seems to be like, there's not a dispute about that. That's an actual tenet of the church. Is that correct?
Oh, it's absolutely core. It's core Mormon doctrine.
Yeah.
And if you're born into it as a 6th generation Mormon like me, it's just fact. Your parents teach you it. You're taught it every 3 hours in church every Sunday. It's just like, that's the world. And then you've got all these non-Mormons who don't know how the world really works. You've got all these Latin Americans and Native Americans that don't know their own history like we do, right? And that's just the way. But then, so it's understandable why someone born in the church would believe that. Why would a convert ever believe it? Most of the time, the Mormon church targets relatively uneducated people or really desperate people that are like really on hard times. And or they use either the flirt to convert method or just like the happy, positive Mormon family sort of situation where they present themselves, and many Mormon families really are just happy, positive, honest, good folks. And if you're desperate enough, or if you're desirous enough for that super happy, positive American family, you'll join, even if there's some beliefs that seem kind of weird at first. And of course, the Mormon missionaries will use biblical scriptures to sort of like loop a Christian in and say, actually, well, Jesus said, other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. He did say that in the Bible. Well, he was talking about the Lamanites and the Nephites. And so there's a way, Joseph Smith, you could almost call the Book of Mormon Bible fan fiction, because Joseph Smith knew the Bible really well. And it's almost like he wrote an American version to kind of parallel the Bible. And so he's able to weave in enough. He uses sort of Old English, just like the Bible, which makes no sense, by the way. Why were Native Americans writing in Old English? Or why was Joseph Smith translating into Old English when he didn't speak Old English? But Mormons just don't think about that. But anyway, it mentions Jesus enough, and it mentions the Bible enough to where a Christian that really is motivated to have that happy, healthy family, or that really cute, young man or woman that's flirting with them, that's enough to say, well, some of those beliefs I don't quite get, but I'm going with it because it feels good, right? And that's ultimately the epistemology, is the missionaries will say, well, pray about it. And if you feel that warm, soft, affirming, positive, warm fuzzy inside, well, that's the Holy Ghost. And then you'll know that the church is true. Well, guess what? If this girl is cute enough, or this boy is cute enough, or you're desperate enough, or that Mormon family looks amazing enough, and you spend enough time with this group that's love bombing you and treating you really special, guess what feelings you're going to get when you pray about the Book of Mormon? You're going to get confirming feelings that sort of lead you in, or you just suspend it and say, whatever, maybe I'll get those feelings later. and the missionaries will teach you, don't, say you believe it, act as though you believe it, and the confirmation will come later. And in all those different ways, those fantastic stories that shouldn't be believed by anyone based on science and evidence become second nature to so many people.
Yeah. It's, as an outsider hearing these stories for the first time I heard this, I was like, that's ridiculous. Nobody would believe that. And then the more I read, and the more I knew a lot of Mormon people, so that medical records company, software company that I work for, a lot of Mormons there, still my friends. Hi, Margie, if you're out there. Hi, Lancer, if you're out there. My manager at some point during my history there was Lancer. He was the big, happy Mormon family person, right? Everybody's very, very, very nice. So I would talk to them, and gently sort of that, especially friends I was close with at work would sort of read me in on this. And I politely was ingesting this without expressing surprise. But internally, I was like, wow, people really genuinely believe this. And it wasn't for years until I put two and two together and figured out what you just talked about, which is the flirt to convert, the desperation, and the big happy Mormon family. And those can present all of their own problems, right? In order to be the big happy Mormon family, you have to subject yourself to sort of that emotional brainwashing that a high demand religion demands. Like you being upset is not pure or not holy or not righteous or not whatever. So you have to pretend to be happy the whole time. Or if you're going after to try to convert desperate people, well, low educated people, desperate people, they tend to live in locations that are not safe. So the Mormon church is sending young missionaries out to not safe neighborhoods. And there have been people who have run into a lot of problems there. So you can run into all these different problems, but the core methodology of convincing a non-believer to believe these things is, I think, absolutely fascinating. Do you run into Have you done any studies, or have you read studies about into that phenomenon? Like I won't call it self-deception, but trying to become convinced, right? Trying to become convinced. What's the brain doing there?
I was a clinical and counseling. My training is in clinical and counseling psychology,
Mm-hmm.
but sort of Psychology 101 talks about confirmation bias.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about motivated reasoning,
Mm-hmm.
and it talks about if you don't know there's a pink elephant, on your drive to work, you'll probably never notice it. But if you're looking for a pink elephant, or if you're looking for the McDonald's sign, or if you're looking for a Volkswagen Bug, you'll see them everywhere. So
Right.
the way the brain works is you kind of see what you're looking for. So yeah, there's all sorts of there's all sorts of really good psychological studies. One is just conformity, the Ash line conformity study, where they get a bunch of Confederates in a study to say a certain line matches the wrong line. And if you get enough people ahead of you saying that the wrong line matches with the wrong line, at least 33% of the time you will say whatever the people ahead of you said, even if you know it's wrong, because of peer pressure and conformity. The Stanley Milgram
the emperor's new clothes phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's saying that the emperor has clothes. I don't see them, but I better say that they do, either because I'm wrong or I want to fit in. I don't want to be excluded by the group.
Yeah. And an even better one is the Stanley Milgram study out of Yale, where they literally
the shock test
had a dude in a white frock with a clipboard asking you to what you believe to be shock another person, and to administer greater and greater charges of electricity. And if you just got some dude over you with a clipboard and a white frock saying, increase the charge, you must complete the experiment, 33% of the participants will administer what they believe to be a lethal charge just because someone's telling them to do it. And so authority is, there's peer pressure, there's authority, there's motivated reasoning, there's confirmation bias, where you'll feel good about the things that resonate with what you want, and you'll tend to dismiss or feel bad about anything that you don't want. All of those and many, many other psychological studies help explain, plus just the phenomenon of flow, or of elevated emotion. If, again, I mentioned this before, but really, really good music, or a really, really good rock concert, or a really, really good movie is going to make you feel this overwhelming sense of joy and happiness under the right circumstances. Especially if you've experienced really hard times or trauma, you might be even more primed to have what's called some sort of theophany or epiphany, just out of pure psychological need or desperation. And so if a church can get you to label or associate the Mormon church being true with some massive, overwhelming sense of feelings and emotion that really are socially informed, then you've made that connection.
Right.
And all of a sudden, I had those amazing feelings. The church must be true.
Sure.
Now I'm going to give my life to it, regardless of the doctrines and the theology. So I'm not a social scientist or a social psychologist, but those are some of the things I've studied over the years.
Absolutely. I did a series on faith healing. In fact, I'm still doing, I've got an ongoing series on faith healing. How did it come about that there are states in this country that have exemptions to charges of manslaughter and even murder if your child dies because you neglected them medically, but the care you were giving them was prayer? right? That's the faith healing problem in America. Especially in Idaho, that's the biggest place where it's a huge problem. So I did a huge series on that, and part of that I said, okay, the claim is that if I pray, I'm going, and I'm a believer, I'm a true believer, or whatever the requirement is, that I will convince God to heal my child, right? And so one whole episode is prayer effective? And I read up a bunch of studies, a ton of studies. And the long and short of it is prayer that is self-reflective, where you're talking to God, is actually effective at the same rate as meditation, trying to get yourself into a trance, all of those sort of, I'm going to calm myself, I'm going to have a lower blood pressure. There's a bunch of benefits to self-reflective prayer, which is it's a low version of what you're talking about. That if I'm trying to get into the church and I feel like I want to believe, if I'm sitting here praying to God and asking for questions, it's going to have some positive effect on me because it's meditation. So yeah, I can see how that definitely starts that feeling. And then there's a very, I'm familiar with those studies of what you talk about, of flow. I've heard story after story of atheists who deconverted from especially evangelical Christian beliefs or Southern Baptist beliefs, where they have these experiences in church. And when they look back on them now, they're like, oh, I have that same experience now when I go to a really good rock concert or I go to the symphony. I was mistaking those feelings and that sensation for the Holy Ghost, when all along I think it was the normal human reaction to having fun, basically.
And maybe they didn't mistake it, but they were primed or conditioned
yes.
to associate the quote
You're being told. Yeah.
their theology with those feelings. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So jumping back, we have Joseph Smith comes up with this tall tale, but obviously from his history as the treasure hunting con man, let's say, one can assume that he's quick thinking and probably fairly charismatic. And he's come up with this tall tale about, hey, angels at least are speaking to me and they have a message and I'm here to deliver it. Are we at the right? Is that where we are in history now?
Yeah. He produces the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm.
It's really honestly, objectively, it's a very poorly written book.
Mm-hmm.
It comes across, if you look at the original transcripts of what he dictated. And again, weirdly, what most Mormons don't know, unless they've watched South Park, is
I love that episode.
we're all taught that Joseph Smith was behind a curtain and he had the gold plates there. And then he had these ancient sort of a breastplate and these spectacles that were God inspired Old Testament prophet spectacles, and that he was sitting there translating the Reformed Egyptian on the gold plates into English, and then a scribe on the other side of the curtain would be writing down what he said. That's what we were all taught growing up. What we learned from South Park or from the internet, once the internet came online, is that actually the same stone in the hat that he used to treasure dig is what he used to produce the Book of Mormon. So literally the plates weren't anywhere in the room. Somehow God needed to deliver the plates to him through an angel. But then when it came time to actually translate the gold plates, they weren't needed. They were somewhere in a bean barrel, hidden from the scribe and from anyone else. And then Joseph would literally take the same hat and the same stone, because remember, people felt not only that Joseph had special power, but that his stone had special power. So he'd take this magic stone that he used in treasure digging, stick it in his hat, stick his face in the hat, and he would come up with the text for the Book of Mormon. It was very colloquial, very folksy, horrible grammar, horrible spelling. And if you just read the original transcript, you're like, this dude is just making a bunch of stuff up. It's Bible fan fiction. But then the editors cleaned it up, put in, capitalization, put in spelling, put in sections, chapters, and verses, and made it seem a little bit more Bible-like. And so, Joseph Smith produces that book. He publishes it in 1830. That's the same year he starts the church. And then weirdly, 2 years later, he tells everyone this story that 12 years prior, God and Jesus Well, actually, he starts out by saying, "The Lord visited me and told me that someday I was going to start a church." Now, again, two years after the church is formed, 12 years after the event literally happened, he starts, he starts telling people
Right.
that basically God, Jesus, as one being, told him to start the church.
Right.
And then eventually, as his theology changes, where he starts to believe that God and Jesus are separate beings,
Hmm.
he actually changes the founding narrative to tell people it wasn't the Lord who visited me, it was God the Father and his son Jesus Christ who both visited me. And so that narrative that God and Jesus told him to start the church comes late and evolves after he's needing to, give people good reasons to continue believing in him after a bunch of things go wrong. Because banks fail, people lose their life savings, like all cults. He starts making passes at people's daughters, at women in his home, other people's wives. Eventually, he starts practicing polygamy unbeknownst to his wife. He takes on, over 30 wives, mother-daughter pairs, sister pairs. I mean, this is like David Koresh,
Hmm.
Warren Jeffs.
Hmm.
Like, you pick Keith Raniere, pick your cult leader. You're not going to find someone that, I mean, you might find someone that outdoes Joseph Smith, but not if you factor in how successful the church has become. You won't find L. Ron Hubbard, doesn't matter who, none of those sort of typical cult leaders
Hmm.
out cults Joseph Smith, at least in terms of sexual predation.
Right.
But yeah, he starts even taking 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds as wives, and in the end, he's killed for his not just his polygamy and polyandry, which is
Hmm.
marrying women married to other men.
Hmm.
He's killed for lying about it, for hiding it from everyone, and for a whole bunch of other things, and hiding it from his own wife and
Right.
the church members. So the church ends in 1844, and then Brigham Young takes over, moves all the Mormons to Utah, and then sort of establishes a theocracy in the desert that has become Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Idaho, southern Canada, and northern Mexico. There's kind of this Mormon belt that goes all the way from southern Alberta all the way down into northern Mexico and Chihuahua. You'll just have massive Mormons. I think Mormons are the top religion in Las Vegas, believe it or not. In
Wow.
Idaho, in many parts of Arizona, they're all Mormon. They were Mormon settlements before then. Gentiles came in and co-developed those territories.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
So, obviously, if everybody knew this story, especially the sort of more cult leader-esque things of I need to sleep with everybody's wives or get married to all of the women. There was a meme I saw online the other day that was a 3-panel comic. Guy comes out and says, I have spoken to God. He's told me to start a cult, and he has told me ... And it cuts to somebody in the audience whispering to a friend, that I need to sleep with all the women, and then it cuts back to the leader that I need to sleep with all the women. It's like that. It's almost humorous at this point that when you hear cult or when you hear a high demand religion or however it is, somewhere in the background, you have a high probability of finding this sort of, as you said, sexual predation. That in the end, you're a human male. You now have power. So you're going to use that to satisfy some of your basic urges because you don't have a competing sort of pressure, either a moral pressure, a social pressure, or a legal pressure to stop you.
Yeah.
So the church at that point, how many people knew? Like, how did he maintain believers? How was he hiding it up? Those are sort of the questions that are fascinating. Once 50, a few generations pass, then it sort of passes into legend, and it's easier to sort of say, well, we're not sure. But in the day, did Brigham Young know, and did he take advantage of the fact that, oh, well, now that Smith is dead, I can sort of change the narrative and run this thing? Or were they
Yeah.
all in the dark?
No, so there by Joseph's death, my understanding is about 300 of his innermost circle knew about polygamy and or were practicing it. Now, those numbers may be off, but that's just my understanding. He kept it really secret. He kind of used it as a way to gain power and influence with his closest followers, to engender loyalty. And again, he had married 22 women before he ever told his first wife, Emma, this Emma that I told you about.
Right.
He married 22 women before she even knew. And she, of course, lost her mind. And, there's rumors that she even was tempted to poison him. But he would lie to the general membership saying he wasn't practicing polygamy. But once Joseph was killed, one of the reasons that the church came undone in 1844 is because one of the highest leaders in the church, his name is William Law, he finds out about polygamy late, after he's already ascended to the highest levels of the church. He's like, that's not right. That's bad. And then Joseph's like, well, then I'm excommunicating you. And so he leaves and he starts a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor. And in that, in 1844, he publishes one edition of the Nauvoo Expositor saying, I believe in the Book of Mormon. I believe Joseph Smith has special power. But as a top leader in the church, I just learned that he was practicing polygamy, that they were like recruiting poor European girls who couldn't speak English to come to America and then matching them with Joseph's friends to be, immigrant plural wives, kind of almost sex trafficking, if you will.
Human trafficking.
Yeah. It was William Law that kind of blew the lid off of Joseph's attempt to hide it. And so, but there was no hiding it. And by the way, what led to Joseph Smith's incarceration was him commanding that printing press be destroyed for printing that one edition of the Nauvoo Expositor. And
I'd like to jump in at this point.
Oh yeah, please.
Because I think my audience will be fascinated by this particular issue, since we focus on church-state separation. At the time, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is the town or city of Nauvoo is what the expositor is named after.
Nauvoo, yep.
Smith is mayor at that time, correct?
He's not just mayor. He's like mayor, chief justice,
chief of the council, all of those people, right?
Militia.
Okay.
He's prophet, seer, revelator,
so
washer. He's got all the power.
He's got all the power.
Like legislative and judicial. He's over it all. He's over it all. He's a monarch. He's a theocratic. He's a theocratic monarch.
Right.
For sure.
So the newspaper edition comes out. He convenes a meeting of the sham meeting, by all accounts, of the town council that lasts about a day and a half, where they do this fake trial. He finds that they have I forget what the charge was, but basically, we don't like it, and we're going to charge them with libel and slander, and this newspaper's lying. He then orders the sheriff to go and destroy the printing press, break in and destroy the printing press, which the sheriff does. Now, at that point, from a Christian nationalism, separation of church and state, this is what the founding fathers are talking about, right? This is exactly it. You're the chief executive of a town governed by the Constitution of the United States. You ordered your thugs to go destroy a newspaper office because you didn't like what they were saying about you personally. Now, it could have been you didn't like what they were saying about your religion, but they didn't attack you, or you couldn't like what they were saying about, broccoli. It doesn't matter. You violated the most important amendment we have to our Constitution, the First Amendment, the freedom of press. You deny people their civil rights under the Constitution. You committed a whole bunch of crimes doing this, all to try to keep this story secret. And this is why we today have to be on alert, because when you get leaders in power that have these instincts, I am the man. How dare you question me? I don't like all this fake news that the press is printing. I want my followers to start beating up reporters. I want my executives to start going in and destroying actual press offices. It's just one step at a time until you end up with, as you said, a theocracy. Exactly. And here it is. It's happening in 1844.
Yep. And Governor Ford, the governor of Illinois, did get involved. And he's the one that convinced Joseph to kind of surrender to a jail. And so he did, Carthage jail. he and a few of his, his brother and a few of his top followers, they surrender. The governor says he'll protect him, and then a mob comes in and assassinates several of them, and at least two of them.
Yeah.
Now let me blow your mind for a second, okay? So
before you do,
oh yeah, please.
Can I read a quote from the governor? Because I think they'll speak volumes. So this is what the governor said once he came to the area and was speaking to or addressing Smith through either the press. I'm not sure if he was physically in the room, but the quote that was recorded by the press is, quote, "I now express to you my opinion that your conduct in the destruction of the press was a very gross outrage upon the laws and the liberties of the people. It may have been full of libels, but this did not authorize you to destroy it. There are many newspapers in this state which have been wrongfully abusing me for more than a year. And yet, such is my regard for liberty of the press and the rights of a free people in a Republican government that I would shed the last drop of my blood to protect these presses from any legal violence." And this again is fairly early on in our country. 1840s is not that long after 1780, when the Constitution came around. So we're not that far off. This is a 2 generations since.
Oh,
and
maybe
we have
1787. I'm rusty.
Yeah.
I'm rusty.
So we have this wonderful speech from this mayor saying, "How dare you? Like, I'm letting them tear me to shreds with lies, but I would die to protect their right to do so. You get this little taste of power, you take over a town, and you become a gangster." That's quite the quote. So sorry to interrupt, but I thought everybody would like to hear that quote.
That's a great quote.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, just to kind of blow your mind, I mentioned that after he's killed, Joseph Smith's killed, Brigham Young takes over. It takes him a good 5 to 10 years to admit publicly that he's practicing polygamy, and he waits till he's safe in Utah as like the governor of the territory to kind of say that publicly. But he starts, letting the members know pretty quickly that polygamy is the way things go. And but here's what will blow your mind. I, 6th generation Mormon, my own grandmother, my mother's mother, was the polygamous daughter of a third wife. I served 2-year mission for my church, went to Brigham Young University, 3 years of church every Sunday, super faithful Mormon, did not learn that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, did not even learn the word polyandry until I was in my 30s.
Wow.
So the church had, the average Mormon that you meet, I would bet $1 million if I had it. I would bet $10,000 now. If you surveyed the average active faithful Mormon who's above 30, more than half will say they were never taught that Joseph had multiple wives. They never heard of any mention of any other wife other than Emma in their entire experience with the church. And none of them were taught that the printing press was destroyed and that Joseph was ultimately martyred because he had been practicing polygamy and had been lying about it and destroyed the printing press. They would have just been taught some vague story about how, like, the wicked people
hated Mormons,
hate the truth,
that
the Lord's chosen are persecuted, and Joseph was killed by a mob because he was standing up for God and his beliefs in the one true church, and that prophets get martyred. But until Mormon Stories podcast and other podcasts and websites and a bunch of really good scholarly books that the church told members for decades to never read, if it weren't for the rise of these scholars and podcasts that the church ultimately excommunicated many of the people, most Mormons today would still never know that Joseph Smith married 14-year-olds, mother-daughter pairs, sister pairs, other men's wives, and that he was killed for that polygamy and for the destruction that he wrought. So imagine running a multiple million member organization in the modern era where you're able to keep that from your membership. And by the way, the Mormons aren't like uneducated rubes.
Right.
Harry Reid was the Senate Majority Leader. Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee for president. These guys go to Harvard, they go to Yale.
And
they too somehow were were warned not to read these books or look at these materials. And so they just like became dentists, became doctors, became lawyers, became moms, and never looked under the covers
Right.
of their own faith.
Right. And we should clarify for people unfamiliar that Mormons get wrongfully grouped into a broader group than they actually constitute. So you have the Church of Latter-day Saints, right? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is what most people will mean by Mormon.
That's
But
right.
you also have the fundamentalist church, the Warren Jeffs church, which is the one that in modern times openly argues for and did practice polygamy in a very, very cult-like situation that you can go read up on Warren Jeffs, and there's documentaries and all that stuff. And sometimes people will conflate the two. Sometimes polygamy is synonymous with Mormon rather than understanding that no, the vast majority of Mormons today not only don't practice polygamy, but as you said, had no idea that it was the main focus of what Joseph Smith was doing, and the reason that it got him killed, because he tried to cover it up by abusing his governmental power. They have no, and that blows my mind, because we live now in this world where I can get on the internet and find anything, but we have to go back just 20 years, and the internet's just starting to really come into its own as far as disseminating information that over time gets affirmed by confirming sources, other documents that agree, references to books that you should go read, and people that you trust sort of educating themselves, and slowly start chipping away at the lock that the church has put on this information.
Yeah. And if I can just tweak what you said a tiny bit.
Sure.
So yeah, think of the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with Warren Jeffs as like, let's just say 20 to 40 to 50,000 people worldwide.
Right.
And they're often in southern Utah, northern Arizona. Sometimes they're in Montana or Wyoming. Sometimes they're in Texas, but they keep to themselves. They look almost Amish.
Yep.
They eschew public interactions. They homeschool. They don't mix with the general population.
Correct.
And they could easily be confused with Mennonites or Amish. So that's the FLDS. There are several other polygamous branches too, all smaller than the FLDS religion. What's weird is that the average Mormon for the past 150 years believes that polygamy is the law of God. So I'm talking about the average member of the LDS church, my faith. Let's just say there's 4 million the church claims around 17 million members. The mainstream LDS church claims around 17 million members. About 2/3 of those are people that left the church or got baptized but never really connected. So think of active self-identifying Latter-day Saints as being around 4 million worldwide, 2 million in the US, 2 million outside of the US. But weirdly, it's in more modern Mormon scripture that celestial marriage or polygamy is God's eternal marriage. That's in our Doctrine and Covenants, D&C 132. And most of us know that our ancestors were polygamists, those of us who were born and raised in the church. So Mormons, even mainstream Mormons, believe in polygamy. They just believe that God stopped it for a temporary stop around 1890, but that it will be brought back. And to make it even more complicated, Mormons get married in the temple, and they believe that if a husband and wife are sealed in the temple, that marriage lasts forever, and that they'll become gods, husband and wife, as gods to rule over their own planet. Today,
I want you to repeat that, because nobody outside the LDSers, so to speak, whenever I mention that to rule over your own planet, that's where they stop believing me when I'm telling me my understanding of the Mormon church. So
they're not being. My opinion is they're not being honest, or
I'm saying my friends, my people who don't know it, like when I'm telling them, here's what Mormons believe, and I say, no, that you are going to get married and you're going to rule over your own planet. They're like, okay, you're pulling my leg. Nobody believes that. I want you to you confirm that this really is a thing.
No, Joseph Smith taught as man is, God once was, and as God is, man may become. And all the prophets since Joseph Smith pretty much have taught that, and that's what we were all taught, that heaven is divided into three main levels: the celestial kingdom, where God and all the faithful active Mormons who are righteous are going to live, and then there's the terrestrial kingdom for like good people that never joined the Mormon church but are good people. And then the celestial kingdom is for the rapists and the murderers and the thieves and, you know, really, really bad people like Hitler. He'll go to the celestial kingdom. In the celestial kingdom, you live with God, you live with your spouse who you got married with in the temple and your children, and you get exalted. And exaltation means you are promoted to the rank of godhood. And then literally with your wife or wives, or with your husband and sister wives, you literally get your own planet and get to do in new worlds what God did in your world. And that's absolute core Mormon doctrine. However, Mormons are embarrassed by that because evangelical Christians and Baptists and an ex-Mormon came out with a movie in the late 70s, early 80s called The God Makers. And they ran that movie in evangelical Christian churches all throughout the United States and abroad. It was super embarrassing. So the church started downplaying and like not emphasizing that doctrine or teaching, and would secretly still believe it, but would stop talking about it, and then slowly hope that the members they left this in the Mormon church leaders like to leave intentional ambiguity with doctrines that are doctrinal but that are inconvenient. And so like this teaching of polygamy, our current prophet Russell M. Nelson, his wife died, who he was sealed to in a Mormon temple, which means he'll be with her for eternity.
He knows her secret name.
He knows her secret name. When she died, he married a new woman, got sealed to her in the temple. And he believes, our prophet, Russell Nelson, believes in 2024 that when he dies and his wives die, he and his two wives, plus any other wives that join, will all be together forever in a polygamous union. Same with our number two, Dehlin H. Oaks. His wife died. He married a new woman. He believes he's been sealed to her in the temple. He believes that he'll be with them. So the average active Latter-day Saint absolutely believes in polygamy and in the new and everlasting covenant or eternal marriage or celestial marriage. They just don't like to talk about it. They feel weird about it. They say we don't understand all things, but it's
God
in our
works in mysterious ways version of who knows.
It's in Doctrine and Covenants section 132. Go read it. Go look it up. Doctrine and Covenants 132. It's all there. And so while we're not practicing it in the flesh today as members, we're still getting sealed in polygamous marriages as Mormons, and we believe we'll be practicing it in the afterlife. That's a really long detour, but I think
no. This is
because it's core Mormon theology.
And it's important.
We're talking about. Yeah.
It's important because religion, people have this sort of dualistic relationship with religion, right? There is the community, there's the family, there's the emotional reward I get from it. There's that part of religion. And then there's the claims, the truth claims that this is true, that's true, this is true. And there's almost a cost, as you were talking about, when you're trying to convert somebody, they almost have to pay a cost to say that they believe these somewhat outrageous to crazy outrageous claims in order to get the community and get the family support and to get the affirmation from the church or your whole state, depending on where you live. So it's important that people understand the truth claims, because even if you down in your core, if somebody asked you and you had to answer honestly and they say, are you convinced that you're going to die and practice polygamy with your one of many wives on your own planet where you will be a god and raise up a new civilization to worship you? They might honestly say, no, I'm not convinced of that, which means they don't believe it. They suspect it, they hope it, they wish it, but they don't believe it. But they don't ever want to say that because somebody might hear them. it feels to them, they've been taught that is, I mean, and this is not unique to Mormonism. You've been taught, the Christian Bible itself, the New Testament talks about a almost an unforgivable sin. The one unforgivable sin is questioning the Holy Spirit, right? That if you even question the Holy Spirit, that you may not even be able to be saved. So that's what you're taught from an early childhood. So even having these doubts can cause you, I'm sure, and you can tell me, an amazing amount of stress.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the average Mormon who's active, I would say a third of active, faithful, believing Mormons would just flat out say, absolutely, we believe that we become God someday and that polygamy is true. I'd say about a third.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's another a third to 2/3 that would be like, well, some believe that, it's not clear. But that's how the modern church has nurtured this ambiguity, literally for PR reasons.
So the church would not bash them if they gave that answer. The church would not say no. They wouldn't step in to clarify. They're actively encouraging you to give the wishy-washy, we're not sure yet.
Yeah. They would say, we don't, the prophet Gordon B. Hinckley, one of our past prophets, was asked about this, and he's like, well, I don't know that we teach it. I don't know that we emphasize it. It's not doctrinal. That stuff that he will say, there's kind of outsider, insider language.
Mm-hmm.
That's a typical, another trait of high demand religions or cults.
Sure.
They've got secret doctrines that they only talk about as faithful insiders. And then the way they talk, just like with Scientology and like Thetans and the
being
volcano,
OT8 and
all that stuff.
Yep.
You don't talk public facing about those weird secret doctrines, or you get in trouble,
And I think that right there, this whole fact that you growing up as a faithful Mormon, by my understanding, for a long time, for many years, you said you weren't till your 30s till you found out some of this.
Yeah.
That the reason that you had those beliefs was because, in some part, that the church made a decision to hide other beliefs from you. That they actively sought to keep you ignorant of all the facts so that they could maintain control, so they could maintain income, so they could maintain, volume and size, so they could have workers to go on missions and grow the church. There's a lot of motivation that this church has to, if not lie, then to commit lies of omission. Am I reading that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The Mormon church currently is worth estimated to be worth $250 billion. That's with the B.
Yeah.
Super wealthy church. And the way that it became super wealthy is by limiting truthful information. So when you get baptized, when Mormon missionaries show up at your door, let's just say you're in Africa or you're in Latin America, let's just say Africa, and the two white Mormon missionaries from Utah and Idaho show up at your door or show up at your hut, knock on the door of your hut and say, we're Mormon missionaries. Do you think for a second that those white Mormon missionaries from Utah and Idaho say, hey, hi, we're missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints kept Black people like you from full membership and full status, kept you out of the temples, and kept men from having the priesthood for about 150 years until 1978, when God, as the Book of Mormon musical says, God changed his mind. And by the way, we taught that Black skin was a curse from God because you Black person and your ancestors, when you lived as spirits in a premortal existence, y'all weren't as faithful to God. Y'all were kind of fence sitters. And so you became Black, and your ancestors became Black, became slaves, because it's what you deserved for being faithful as spiritual children in a previous life. Do you think that in 2024, when they're in Kenya and Nairobi, that's how the Mormon missionaries lead? Obviously, no. They leave all that out. They leave out the stone in the hat. They leave out the treasure digging. They leave out the polygamy. They leave out, 50 other super problematic, racist, sexist, homophobic things. And they teach like Jesus loves you and God loves you and you can pray and the Holy Ghost will bless you. And this is this church is led by Jesus, and you want to be like Jesus. Well, you need to be baptized to be like Jesus. And I mean, there's a little bit more. Oh yeah, pay 10% of your income to the church for
Right.
life.
Right.
Right? There's 3 degrees of heaven. We have the priesthood. You need to get baptized, and eventually you can get married in the temple. I just basically told you what the 6 missionary discussions are for
Mhm.
someone getting baptized, and all the good, gritty, Joseph Smith getting killed for destroying your printing press. You don't even learn growing up as a faithful member who's like 6th or 7th generation most of the time. And
Right.
so, yeah, it's through conscious, willing, knowing deception, because the church has known about these problems the whole time, but they literally intentionally chose to hide it both from the world and from the membership when it suited them. And so that's why, I think we share a common mission. I call it informed consent. I'm not trying to take people out of the Mormon church.
Right.
I'm not trying to tell people not to join. I
Yeah.
just believe that anyone in it or anyone investigating it deserves to know the truth about it. And then if they decide it's still true for them, I'm like, thumbs up. There's a lot of great things about this church.
Sure.
There's a lot of good things about the religion, but everyone deserves to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this phenomenon is not unique to Mormonism. This phenomenon of hiding the uncomfortable history, the uncomfortable parts of Scripture. It's not even unique to high demand religions.
Yeah.
The trope of the dark skinned person is being punished because they sinned previously or they have a curse on them. That's straight out of the book of Genesis. It speaks of Noah putting a curse on Ham because he saw Noah being drunk, and the curse was that Ham and his descendants shall be dark skinned, right? And maybe that's where Joseph Smith got it. I don't know. I'm just sort of making that up, but that's an uncomfortable passage. In the Bible, the original Old Testament and New Testament are filled with uncomfortable truths, right? When you go to a Baptist or Episcopalian or Catholic or just a non-denominational service, and people encourage you to go to Bible study, they don't open it up uh, and say, okay, today we are going to study all the rules of how you can enslave people from around you and keep them as your property and use them as sex slaves and pass them on to your kids, and how you can't kill them, but if you beat them and they live for a couple of days, that's okay. And then if they die later, that's okay. They don't start with those things. They start with what you said. There was this little baby Jesus, and he came to save the world, and people didn't like him, but he did all these wonderful things, and then he died for you. Don't you feel guilty? And that's the story. But it's every religion it seems to have, and even if you take it out of the context of religion, political parties and corporations will have these things that they use their power, use their influence to hide from people, either legally hide or nefariously hide, because it benefits them. And I think the fascinating part is that that the humans have been conditioned to say, when it's a man of God, so to speak, a man of the cloth telling me these things, I am going to be less skeptical. I am going to accept these claims more readily than if it's some CEO or some politician or some snake oil salesman. We're skeptical about all of those to a higher degree than when our pastor comes down and says, well, yeah, there was some polygamy going on, but who knows? Who can tell? Yeah, you probably don't want to read those books over here. Like, you somehow, culture has trained you to be more susceptible to those claims than claims from people who aren't priests or representatives of a church. And that, I think, makes it even more, you're more susceptible, and it makes it almost more insidious that people rely on that to hurt you ultimately, i.e. take 10% of your income without full consent, as you say, based on them keeping you in the dark. It's
Absolutely.
very disturbing. So for you, for your Mormon story, it sounds like you're 6th generation, as you pointed out. You were raised to believe all of this stuff. What started I don't know if you call it a deconversion or a crisis of faith, what started your questioning of your previously held beliefs?
Great question. Thanks for asking. So a common metaphor in the Mormon and post-Mormon world is the idea of a shelf, that you learn things along the way that don't quite sound right, and the church encourages you to kind of put them on a shelf, to put them on the back burner, to have faith, and later you'll figure things out. So there's this idea of putting items on the shelf, and then the idea of cracks developing in your shelf. And so, some items that were on my shelf from a very early age, my parents were married in the temple, and we were taught about eternal families and that we would all be with our siblings and our parents in heaven forever. Well, my parents got divorced when I was in middle school, and then all of a sudden both of them remarried, and eventually both of them remarried Mormons. So they needed to get a temple divorce, and then they needed to get temple marriage to their third spouses respectively. And all of a sudden I was left like a spiritual orphan. I'm like, well, will I be with mom and my stepdad, or will I be with my dad and my stepmom? I don't think they want to hang out together in heaven. So who am I with? So that was a question I had from a very young age. Also in high school, I divided the number of Mormons in the world by the number of people in the world, and I got like less than 0.5%. And all my friends were like Baptist and evangelicals, and I'm like, wow, God really plays favorites. If this is God's one true church, he's really, providing that. If the whole purpose of the life is to join the one true church, and less than 0.5% of his children get to do that, that just doesn't seem fair. So, yeah. And then, of course, I remember in 1978 when the church gave Black members the priesthood and the ability to enter the temple. And, and I played basketball in Katy, Texas with Black friends, and the racism stuff never made sense to me. So those were all cracks along the way, or shelf items that I would put on my shelf.
Or as they say in the musical, the light switch that you just have to turn it off. And
exactly. Very good. We should do shots every time there's a Book of Mormon musical.
My viewers know, yours probably don't. I am a huge Broadway musical fan, so I don't want to. It's not my only source, but I will probably be playing some music at the end of this interview related to that, because as for people who don't know, Book of Mormon, huge musical hit, very funny, written by the makers of South Park, who are both atheists, but they describe it as an atheist's love letter to religion, and I fully agree with that. Being a fan of it, it focuses on the weirdness, and then saying, despite the weirdness, it can inspire people to do good things. So I hate to harp on it. I know that some people in the church don't appreciate it. All my Mormon friends love it. So
it's brilliant, and I'm a huge Broadway musical fan too. So I'll welcome all the
more parallels.
So yeah, I turned those things off. I put those items on the shelf. I had a corrupt mission experience. So I was called to serve my 2-year Mormon mission in Guatemala. And long story short, missionaries would go out. There were missionaries in our mission that would go out to a soccer field on a Saturday, play soccer with like 10 kids who were missing teeth and had no shoes, get them really hot. And then they'd bring them back to the chapel where there was a baptismal font, and they would say, hey, you want to follow Jesus and cool off and get baptized? And they would baptize like 10 kids at a time.
Wow.
Never teach their parents, never even get parental consent, never even take them to church. And then they would do that 4 times in a month and get 40 baptisms in a month, and then teach all their fellow missionaries to do it. And all of a sudden my mission became like the second highest baptizing mission in the world, over I think 700 baptisms a month with like 150 or 200 missionaries. And I thought that was horrific. I thought that was like a huge, egregious violation of the holy, ordinance of baptism. And my mission president, his name was Gordon Romney, he was super ambitious, and he wanted to become a general authority. I presume he wanted to climb the ranks of church leadership. He's actually a cousin to Mitt Romney. And so he yelled at me. He ended up sending me home 4 months early because I was expressing concern about these just grotesque baptismal practices.
Yeah, it's like it's like the Enron of religions, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's all fraudulent paperwork, basically.
Yeah.
These people never gave consent. And if you are, I'm assume, if you are a good-hearted, genuine believer and you see this, you have to think, does our doctrine even say that they're they're actually saved? Isn't our religion more than just a shaman shaking a stick over a baby or an unaccepting or unknowing person? Because that's all we're doing here. Like, they're not knowingly consenting to
Yeah.
believing anything or agreeing or affirming that they want to even investigate or believe in this church. They're just literally, oh, you told me this is where the water is, splash, and then you draw a tick mark on the chalkboard.
Yep. Yeah.
Wow.
And it is fraud. However, religions thrive in paradox, beliefs that contradict each other. And while we're all taught that baptism is sacred, we're also taught that every soul is sacred, and we're taught obedience to authority. I would say the most sacred teaching in Mormonism by far is obedience to authority.
I was wondering about that.
Yeah. No.
That's amazing.
Yeah. In fact, we're taught obedience is the first law of heaven. Um, Obey with exactness, exact obedience. As a missionary, you're literally taught exact obedience. And so, yes, baptism's sacred, but every soul is sacred. You can't make it into the celestial kingdom without a baptism. And then your mission president is pressuring you. So you baptize the little kid and you think, well, Jesus must like it because baptism's good and Jesus got baptized and my leader's pressuring me to do it. So it happens. There's cheeseburger baptisms in Mormonism. There's swimming pool or beach party baptisms. There's baseball baptisms. But most Mormons either block out that part of their mission or they just never learned it. But our history, definitely all the way back to the 1960s, a huge chunk, a third of the 17 million people that were baptized in the Mormon Church that the Mormon Church claims are these type of super low quality baptisms that came out of Mexico, Central America, Latin America, the Philippines, and now Africa. And interestingly, the Mormon Church is actually dying in England and in Scotland and in France and in Japan and in Korea, and even in the United States and Canada, kind of the developed Western world. The Mormon Church is declining in growth and or declining in absolute membership. And what it's doing to offset its decline is by baptizing like crazy in Africa, because the Philippines and Latin America are kind of burned over. Like, we've been baptizing there like crazy forever, and they're kind of onto us. And so the church is literally expanding, going bananas in sub-Saharan Africa as a way to offset statistically its own hemorrhaging, even in Utah. Like in Utah, in Salt Lake City, Utah, every month a new Mormon chapel is shut down, closes. They close wards, they close stakes.
Wow.
They're closing down missions throughout the world, except in Africa. And, the church would say, we love everyone and isn't a blessing. We're bringing these beautiful African children. We're not racist. We're baptizing all these Africans into the church. Isn't the church progressive and loves Black people? When in reality, a huge motivation for that is there the last super large population of less educated, more socioeconomically compromised people. And it's kind of just fresh meat. And that's literally a core internal motivation for our expansion in Africa, which to me is kind of gross, especially if you realize that they're not being taught that the church was systemically, doctrinally racist for over 150 years. It's a real, and nobody talks about this type of stuff, but it's absolutely a fact.
Yeah. And in my sort of cultural zeitgeist, I've absorbed the fact that as of, I don't know, 10 years ago, the Mormon Church, and you can correct me on this, would claim in their marketing, we are the quote unquote fastest growing religion in the world. At some point in my life, that was a marketing pitch I saw. Is that something that they still claim? Am I remembering right that they used to claim that?
In the 80s and 90s, the church believed that by now there would be hundreds of millions of Mormons throughout the world.
Right.
And it was growing bananas statistically in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And then once these baptism techniques started to backfire, once they started to become a PR disaster for the church, once the church was not able to care for all those people who were baptized without real conversions or testimonies. And then once America started fading in popularity worldwide, um, the growth started to slow. And then definitely once the internet around 2004, 2005, with blogs and then podcasts and then Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and YouTube channels, the church has just gotten its rear end handed to it as the members started to learn all the things that the church had been hiding from them for generations. And that's why, and it's not just a Mormon thing. Religion overall in the developed world is on the ropes. We've got this whole phenomenon called the rise of the nuns, Nones.
Yep.
Every Christian religion, almost every Christian denomination is in decline. And you could argue that the Mormon church is declining it's slightly less of a pace, but the past 10, 20 years have been terrible, not just for the Mormon church, but for Christianity across the United States and elsewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you are faced with this, right, you have your experience on a mission, you learn this information, you see what's going on with your own family, and you're struggling to deal with all of these, the books on your shelf getting heavier and heavier.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? What's your reaction? Do you sort of turtle up and try to defend your brain from being inquisitive, or do you dig in and say, at some point you obviously say, well, I want to know the truth. When did that happen, I guess, is my question.
Yeah. So I started digging in after my mission. I came home traumatized by the spiritual and psychological violence that my mission president sort of wrought on me. But I needed to get really good grades to be able to have a good career. So I started asking questions, and I found some progressive or liberal professors at BYU that I could kind of, ask my more difficult questions to, and they would give me some progressive liberal answers that kind of pacified me by the time I graduated from college. Go ahead.
We should clarify for our listeners. When you say liberal, I think you're meaning in a liberal arts sort of progressive type of thing, not necessarily I'm voting for Biden type of thing.
Yeah. So we're talking early 90s here. And some of those professors were Democrats, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is you don't have to believe everything that the church teaches. The church leaders make mistakes. These are things you would never learn growing up. Right. In the church, you would obey, follow the prophet. The prophet speaks with God. The Book of Mormon is the word of God. It's the truest scripture. Joseph Smith was God's prophet. Obey what you're told. Don't drink coffee. Don't drink alcohol. No, don't have premarital sex. Give 10% of your income to the church, and get married in the temple. Have lots of kids, and rinse and repeat. So that's what you grow up with. But then I met these professors at BYU that are like, well, yeah, Joseph Smith made some mistakes. And, well, some people pay tithing on their net and some pay on their gross. And, well, the Bible, you don't have to take the flood literally. Maybe it was a regional flood and God didn't kill everyone and all the animals and children in the world. Maybe that's just how the people at the time interpreted a regional flood, and it wasn't God, and in the Book of Mormon, maybe it's history, or maybe it's like Paul Bunyan and Babe in the Blue Ox, and maybe it's myth, and maybe scriptures don't have to be literal. Maybe they can just have they can still be spiritual and even from God, but maybe they're not historical. And maybe the earth isn't 6,000 years old. And maybe God created humans through the evolutionary process, and then at the right point in time sent his divine spirits into the monkeys. And that's when humans started, but it was through evolution, and the earth is actually billions of years old. These are the types of teachings that a progressive or a liberal, a spiritually, doctrinally liberal professor or Mormon leader would teach someone who is doubting and questioning. And maybe it's not God's one true church. Maybe all churches have truth, and maybe all churches are good and bad. And this is our tribe. But there's many ways up Mount Fuji. These were the types of things I learned at BYU that made me feel like, okay, I don't have to leave the church. I could be like a progressive Jew. I could be like a Reconstructionist or a Reformed Jew, or a progressive liberal Catholic. And this could be my tribe. It could be my identity. It could be how I raise my kids and give them a moral foundation. Maybe it's true with a lowercase t, but not true with a capital T.
Right.
And that literally got me out of BYU and sort of 10 years into my married life, where I'm, working at Bain, working at Arthur Anderson, working at Microsoft, having lots of kids, doing all the stuff. But always that shelf just keeps getting way more and more weighed down with problems. So it wasn't until I was at Microsoft, I was in my early 30s, and I was called, ironically, to teach what's called early morning seminary to Mormon high school students. So every 6 a.m., Mormon high school students outside of Utah and Idaho and Arizona show up at the church and receive religious instruction for an hour each day, 5 days a week, before they go to class. And that's where the church really indoctrinates its high schoolers so that they want to serve missions once they graduate from high school. So I was called to be a seminary teacher, or the person that indoctrinates the high school students in my Issaquah, Washington, Mormon ward or congregation, while I was working at Microsoft. And it was there that I just said, you know what? Okay, all those things I put on the shelf, now I've got some time. My career's doing well. Most of my kids are born. I'm going to start reading these books that I was warned not to read because I'm strong and I'm committed. And that's when I learned about Joseph Smith's Extra Wives, the Book of Abraham, and the scriptural fraud that Joseph Smith was involved with. The fact that the Book of Mormon does not stand up to genetic scrutiny, linguistic scrutiny, geographic scrutiny, anthropological scrutiny. There's no scientific evidence that supports the core Book of Mormon narrative from any angle. And we're taught that the Book of Mormon is the keystone of our religion. We're taught that Joseph Smith is next to Jesus in righteousness. And when all of a sudden you find out that the Book of Mormon was probably fan fiction, and that Joseph Smith was betting 15-year-olds and mother-daughter pairs and other women married to other men, that's when it all came crashing down, as I was trying to be the best seminary teacher I could be for the church. So it was a weird, very, very weird, dark time for me and my family.
That is not an uncommon story. I have heard many people, both famous podcasters like Matt Dillahunty, a famous atheist debater, down to people who call in or friends who have talked to me. And there's a common thread here, which is what we've discovered here, which is I believed for some reason, maybe because even though I didn't have sufficient evidence. And then there came a point in my life where something called me to shore up my belief by going and getting that evidence. So I go and I study the Bible. I study the Book of Mormon. I go and read the history, because surely in those books will be the answers to these questions that have been piling up my brain. And that will make me a better missionary, a better missionary, a better example of what it is to be a good Mormon, a better debater, or whatever it may be. And then they start reading, and there's no there, right? It's just empty, or contradictory, or immoral, or all three. And that is a very common story, that people get to that point and they realize, wow, to put it in Christian terms, 1 Peter 3:15 tells me to always be ready to give a reasoned defense to anybody who asks me about my hope, my faith. So I want to do that, but you got to give me something. And then when you go to turn to the Bible or the history or the scrolls or the morality, there's nothing there. And that's got to be just a you have a worldview, and it's got to at some point shatter that worldview and do massive psychological damage to a person.
Yeah. And while it's a very common narrative in 2024, it was not a common narrative in 2001
Right.
when I went through it. There was no one to talk to. My own brother worked at Microsoft, and we're very close. We always have been,
Mm-hmm.
and he's super smart, smarter than me.
Mm-hmm.
And he just was, because of his personal relationship, his family relationships, etc. I'm like, bro, guess what I just learned? And he's like, la la la, I want to talk about it. I can't talk about that. It's going to ruin my life. And I'm like, okay, try and talk to my parents. They're like, we don't know anything about this. Try and talk to my bishop. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And by the way, if you start talking about this and spreading these doubts to other members, we're going to have a conversation.
Right.
And so, like, there was nowhere to go. And that's when I sort of reached a several year period of despair and depression. Just not only my worldview had fallen apart, but I couldn't talk to anyone. And then, but I also, the silver lining is that's where I found my purpose in life. Remember how I said I just did tech because law didn't work out and I was trying to find my purpose. This became my purpose. By 2004, I'm like, the internet is going to blow the doors off of this problem once people are able to access the information on websites. So what I'll do is I'll get ahead of that curve, start a podcast, and then I'll be, through helping people tell stories, interviewing people, I'll be able to provide support for people like me. And that's how I left Microsoft and started Mormon Stories podcast in 2005 as a way to be a solution to the problem that I knew was coming.
And I'm seeing an arc here in your career and your belief journey, that you start off like me, poli-sci, looking for a job, just trying to stay focused on life. But then you move into instructional technology. That's what you get your master's in.
Yeah.
And then now you have a PhD in clinical and counseling psychology, and you coach people on how to deal with this. So I see a constant progression from heads down worker, like we all start out, to wanting to generally be in education and help people, to, oh, now I've got the background, I've done my publications, I've done my research, I've done my training. I can actually help people dealing with what presumably you were dealing with when you went through this. Is that what you do now with your, I don't know if you want to call it a practice or what, but is that what you strive to do with your podcast and your coaching?
Yeah. So originally, the idea was to get a PhD in instructional technology because I knew tech and education would be the way that I helped people. And that's where I learned about podcasts. I stopped with my master's because I realized that a PhD in instructional technology wasn't really going to help me. I did Mormon Stories as my master's thesis for my instructional technology master's.
Oh.
And then as soon as the podcast was launched, it was like I had popped a huge balloon in the sky of pain and suffering. And it started growing exponentially right from the start because there were tens of thousands of Mormons around the world who were they were a closeted gay man or woman in a mixed orientation marriage, somebody who was, quote, in a sex addiction, meaning that occasionally they would masturbate and look at porn, but they thought they were a broken,
oh my goodness,
dirty, perverted, evil person because their wife caught them masturbating or whatever. Or maybe they harbored doubts about polygamy or Joseph Smith, but they couldn't talk to anyone. Whatever it was, they found out about my podcast, and then they would ask to meet me. They would call me. They would come to Logan, Utah to meet me. I would meet them whenever I would travel for my jobs with MIT. Or whatever, the Carnegie Foundation. And I just realized that there was an endless need. And people would come to me telling me I'm addicted to alcohol, I'm addicted to drugs, I'm self-harming, I'm suicidal. I've gone 5-10 years with anxiety or OCD or religious scrupulosity or depression. And I'm like, I don't know how to help you guys. And that's when I realized I needed to get a PhD in clinical and counseling psychology so that I could at least point people in the right direction. because it turns out there's this term comorbidity with a psychological diagnosis. Sometimes people have more than one diagnosis. Well, several mental illnesses, diagnosable mental illnesses like anxiety, depression, suicidality, scrupulosity, trauma, PTSD, they're comorbid with a religious faith crisis coming out of a cult or a high demand religion. And so I needed to become educated about mental health so that at a minimum, I could counsel people or refer them to someone else who could help them, because they were not just coming to me with a faith crisis. It's like, I'm gay. How do I ungay myself? Or I'm gay. How do I come out to my wife? Because we have 4 kids and I'm a bishop in the Mormon church, whatever it was.
Right.
And so the psychology became a natural way for me to get a degree, credentials, education, a research base, just to be able to help the people that came to me from my podcast. And I also thought maybe I could make a living, because back in 2005, nobody was monetizing podcasts. Even in 2015, almost no one was monetizing podcasts because most people had never heard of podcasts, even by 2014, 2015. It's just been in the past 8 to 10 years that podcasts have really taken off. So I started a nonprofit in 2010, finished my PhD in clinical and counseling psychology in 2015. And that's when I just said, I'll just try and do this full time, see how it goes. And the truth is, the nonprofit is it's grown every single year since we started it. And now I have a big staff, and we grew. We had over 1 million new subscribers to YouTube just in the previous year. And the previous year before that, we had 1 million new subscribers. So we've basically gone from 50 to 250,000 YouTube subscribers in 2 years.
Wow.
And so I don't practice psychology, but occasionally I will coach people if they just want some tips on how to navigate the complexities of a faith crisis.
Right.
You can go to johndehlin.com and /coaching. But at most I'll have 1 or 2 clients a week. I don't do it for the money. I do ask people to pay, but I just do it to help people. I have more work than I could ever hope to accomplish with my podcast and with the nonprofit.
Yeah, I did go to your website when I was getting to know what you were doing, and I did read your publication section and all of that. And you seem to be focused in, at least correct me if I'm wrong, when you were publishing things on that gay, lesbian, bisexual experiences as it relates to Mormonism or high demand religions. Is my reading of your publication history correct? Is that what you were focused on? Sort
of. So I actually met the criteria for a master's in psychology on my way to my PhD. So for my master's thesis, I developed with my advisor a treatment for religious obsessive compulsive disorder. So my first real focus clinically was on scrupulosity or religious OCD. And so we ran a clinical trial and published our results on how to treat scrupulosity or religious OCD. So that was the first clinical focus. And then I needed another focus for my PhD. And so for my PhD, you have to remember, back in 2010, the Mormon Church and most evangelical churches, Orthodox Jews, they were encouraging conversion therapy for their gay, lesbian, or bisexual or transgender members.
Right.
So it wasn't anything more than like people. I found out, once the Mormon Church got into promoting Proposition 8 in California to taking same-sex marriage away from gay same-sex married Californians. And then I started noticing this rising suicide epidemic amongst gay and lesbian Mormon youth and young adults. I kept looking in the obituary and seeing another drama student from Sandy, Utah has taken his life after he served a Mormon mission, but without ever getting married. I wonder, and I'm stereotyping, but
no, absolutely.
After I saw enough and had enough podcast listeners come to me and tell me they were suicidal, or they got into a mixed faith marriage, or they were trying to live a life of celibacy, or they had engaged in conversion therapy or electric shock therapy, which was a thing at Brigham Young University in the 70s. They literally ran tests to shock, to deliver an electric shock to gay BYU students. There's even reports that they administered shock to their genitals.
Oh, wow.
Or to use chemical castration or other types of aversive stimuli to ungay, BYU students who were Mormon. Like, that's a whole thing. Anyway,
Right. The stereotypical phrase is, the light version of it is pray the gay away, but it's much more insidious than that. It sounds like, I know from a legal perspective, there were a lot of cases of issues with kidnapping, consent. If my son's 18, I can't force him to go, but I hire somebody to take him to this camp anyway to try to do this conversion therapy stuff. So it's not unique to Mormonism, but it sounds like you were seeing a huge rise during this period.
Yeah, it was. I mean, just honestly, it was still that was what the church would say. If you're gay and a male, marry a woman and it'll go away. If you're gay, if you're a lesbian and Mormon, marry a man and have kids and it'll go away. And if you need any help, do conversion therapy. That's how things were in 2010.
Wow.
So that'll be, now that I've done scrupulosity, that'll be my PhD dissertation. And so I did I think, I don't say this to brag, but I think it was a groundbreaking study at the time. We surveyed 1,612 either current or former Mormons who identified as somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
It was it's probably one of the largest studies of its kind in the history of the mental health field. And what we showed was that conversion therapy and specifically religious attempts to change your sexual orientation, like prayer or fasting or hyper-religiosity or confessing to your bishop, were the most common and the most damaging ways that a gay Mormon would try and change their sexual orientation. We were able to show incredible harm, and that led to a TED Talk in 2013 where I released a TEDx talk where I released the results of my study to the public. We published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, which is the premier flagship research publication for counseling psychology. We published 12 or 13 other peer-reviewed academic journal articles from that one study of 1,612 students. And eventually, two things happened. The Mormon Church slowly started to discourage conversion therapy and discourage mixed orientation marriage and move away from its barbaric, deadly teachings. And they excommunicated me because I was openly promoting same-sex marriage, and that was against the church's doctrine and theology. Plus, by that time, by 2015, my podcast had become very, very popular. I had been asked to be on Good Morning America, VH1, Nightline. With Mitt Romney running for president, the media was starting to reach out to me and have me be kind of the talking head Mormon guy.
Right.
And for all those reasons and the podcast popularity, the church said, stop advocating for same-sex marriage and shut down that podcast, or we're going to excommunicate you. And I said, excommunicate me, because I cannot, in good conscience, shut down the podcast and stop advocating for people that are killing themselves. And so the church excommunicated me in 2015.
Wow. So you are, I'm going to sort of abstract this out a little bit, because I think this is a pattern you see everywhere. You are coming at the situation with observations, experiments, and evidence, and pointing out a real problem. And the church is saying, we don't care about that part. We want you to shut up and stop saying it's okay to be gay, and you refuse. And for that, they kick you out of the church. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yep. And they didn't just kick me out.
Right.
And then in 1992, 93, 94, there was a wave of excommunications of scholars while I was at BYU. They're generally known as the September 6th. After me, there was a wave of excommunications of other internet activists who were either encouraging, women's rights in the church. There were women excommunicated for that. There were others advocating for truthful history. They were excommunicated. And there were one courageous man, Sam Young, he was simply advocating for children, against child abuse within the church
Sure.
and against one-on-one meetings with church leaders and children, where it very often happens, and Boy Scouts. And the church excommunicated him, a former bishop, literally just for trying to prevent child abuse in the church because they decided it was embarrassing. So for a good 5 to 10 years, and a mental health professional named Natasha Helfer, she was simply teaching that masturbation's healthy, that that Mormon therapists should follow ethical guidelines and not preach religion and things like conversion therapy to their clients. They excommunicated her. So it's come back to bite the church, but I wasn't the only one that eventually, I was one of the first, but I certainly wasn't the only person excommunicated.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of this reminds me to mention at this point, for people who may be having these issues, of course, you can read up and on Dr. Dehlin's work. You can visit his website. You can look at the Mormon Story podcast. But more generally, there are other organizations that I would recommend. You may have heard of these or worked with them, but there's Recovering from Religion is an organization that helps people who have been raised in religious environments that they are trying to leave and are having problems with, either very hard problems, like if I come out to my evangelical parents, they're literally going to kick me out of the house and I may die, all the way to I've been out of my religion for 20 years and I'm still having dreams about hell. Like they do a lot there. And then there's the Secular Therapy Project. These are a group of therapists who promise not to bring religion into their counseling as a proposed solution. That's a high level summary, but basically there's a real problem in America where you go to see a therapist and after a few weeks of getting to know you, they might surprise you and say, I think you need to pray more or something like that. And you're like, what? That's not what I'm looking for. So Secular Therapy Project is out there. And then another one that's sort of related that I wanted to ask you about is, have you heard of the Clergy Project?
Yeah, I've actually heard of all those programs.
Okay.
For sure. Yeah.
So the Clergy Project, for our listeners, is an anonymous organization of people who are preachers or otherwise church leaders who have lost their faith but haven't yet left their role in the church. So I'm a preacher in a small town. I no longer believe in whatever religion I believe in, and I know that if I announce this to my flock, I will lose my job. I will be shunned. I can't hire a babysitter. I can't hire anybody to cut my yard. Nobody's going to sit with me at the high school football game. My life is over. And from a very young age, maybe all I've done is be a preacher. I don't have marketable skills. So if I leave my job, it's going to be maybe go work as a janitor if there's any jobs in town. So a group formed to sort of talk about these issues without being out so they could get support and strategies on how to modify and make their sermons, I'd say, more moderated, not as extreme, not as literal in the Bible. Did you see that when you were starting Mormon Stories and people were coming to you? I'm assuming initially they're off the record before you could get anybody to be on the show and talk. But did you see a similar sort of culture of an underground sort of confederacy of people who had their doubts and wanted to work within the church to try to change it? Or did you feel totally alone for a long time, even after you started your podcast?
Yeah. So something that's different about Mormons and Scientologists and Jehovah's Witnesses and Orthodox Jews is that you're taught, it's such an insular culture, and you're taught so much suspicion of outsiders that, like, a Mormon bishop in a million years, if he were struggling with his faith, or even a doubting Mormon, would never go to a never-Mormon or even an ex-Mormon to get help.
Wow.
Because you risk your spouse divorcing you, your children disowning you, your parents cutting you out of their will. You risk, if you're a dentist, if you live in Idaho or Arizona or Utah, there's a good chance that your clients, whether you're a doctor or a dentist or a lawyer or an executive, there's a good chance your business partners or your coworkers or your customers are Mormon, and you risk marital ruin, familial ruin, social. You risk losing all your friends. You risk losing your community because your friends are your church co-workers for the most part, and you risk losing your job and your income. And so that's why for me it was really important when I started Mormon Stories to have it feel safe, to have it feel inviting, to have it feel very Mormon, not angry, not even super directly confrontational or critical of the church. And many tell me Mormon Stories remains relatively positive and affirming and safe feeling for a questioning Mormon.
Sure.
Because no, in a million years, those organizations you mentioned are not going to be attractive to someone coming out or questioning Mormonism. But they are great organizations.
Sure.
The other thing I'll say is that because we started blogging in 2004 as Mormons and ex-Mormons, and then we started podcasting with Mormon Stories in 2005, and then other podcasts started emerging. Ex-Mormons kind of dominate of all the ex-religious groups. You just go to Reddit and look up ex-Scientologists, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, ex-Orthodox Jews, ex-evangelicals. Nobody compares to the number of ex-Mormons. The ex-Mormon subreddit has like 300,000 members. Again, Mormon Stories podcast has like 250,000 just YouTube subscribers. We've got over 100,000 Facebook subscribers, like 270,000 TikTok followers. Like in some ways, because we had to serve ourselves and because we got at it early and developed a culture of doing and of serving, in some ways, I think that's why Mormon Stories is 60% never-Mormon, because we're actually leading. I'm not saying other organizations aren't doing great things, but in many ways, whether it's ex-Mormon Reddit, blogs, YouTube channels, TikTok. If you want to have a wild time, just go to TikTok and type in ex-Mormon. There are billions and billions and billions of views of hundreds, if not thousands, of ex-Mormon TikTok content creators that are creating amazing creative TikTok videos every single day. Right. So I'm really proud of the ex-Mormon, the progressive and the post-Mormon and the ex-Mormon communities for the way that we've not only helped each other as kind of pioneers in the tech world, but as we've kind of in some ways shown leadership to the rest of the world, and certainly to ex-members of other cults or high-demand religions. And, I've had Jehovah's Witnesses on Mormon Stories. Leah Remini and Mike Rinder came on Mormon Stories. Sarah Edmondson of Nexium. Like, I'm very proud of my collaborations. Stephen Hassan, we've brought Stephen Hassan, the world cult expert, to Utah, had him do, a retreat here, brought him on the podcast. I'm super happy that we've collaborated with so many amazing, with so many members of other cults or high demand religions.
Right.
I should say.
Yeah. And I said at the beginning that I would get back to, that we would eventually work ourselves back to this concept that there's 60% never-Mormons listen to your podcast, and I was one of them. And I think in talking to you today, I have explored, I've been thinking all along, where is it? Where's the hook? What is it that fascinates me? And I think I want to make it sound mundane, but I think it is the same reason that I like reading novels or watching movies. Is every story is different, and every story addresses a very core human condition that is then possibly exploited by a religious organization. And that condition is a desire to feel like you're mean something, this psychological state of I am, the center of things. And so I want to mean something, and I want to be part of something bigger. And religions have developed to take advantage of that instinct. And it's so powerful. That instinct is so powerful that it can cause people to go through changes in belief that seem very fascinating to somebody who's never been through that. And it makes one worry about yourself. Like, if I had been born in the middle of a different nation, if I was born, let's say, in Rome, I might be Roman Catholic instead of an atheist right now. Or if I was born in Utah, I might be a Mormon right now. And the realization of that what religion you are really depends almost entirely on where you were born and who your parents were, can be very scary to people. Like, are we really that malleable in our beliefs? And hearing your stories of person after person coming on and telling a similar story to yours with important differences paints a very broad brush to say everybody goes through this. Everybody. It's not just a Mormon thing. It's not just a cult thing. There are Catholics struggling with mass amount of guilt. There are, as you said, Orthodox Jews who are trying to figure out what to do with their children because they know that they're not supposed to get them vaccinated. There's Christian Scientists who don't want to let their kids die, but they wish that the church would just change their policy, but they feel stuck like they have to not treat their kids because of this community, because of all of these instincts. So hearing you talk about this, I think for non-Mormons, it's both educational, but also fascinatingly scary and interesting study of the human condition, like a very core piece of the human condition. It makes listening to your show makes me feel like we're all in the same boat. It may be about different things or different religions or whatever, but everybody is just trying to figure out life, be a good person, enjoy themselves while they have time on this earth, and try to help other people. And that's what I hear time and time again on your show, is that that tends to be where people end up. And that seems to be where you have ended up, that you have gone through this transition from being a sixth generation LDS that was kept in the dark to getting involved in education, getting involved in information dissemination, to being now running this podcast that is changing lives left and right. How does that feel looking back on that?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that acknowledgement. And I'll just say, like, I remember when I saw The Village for the first time, or Pleasantville, or
Yes.
The Truman Show.
Right.
I'm like, wait, or Tangled. I'm like, wait, they're describing. Wait, were those guys Mormon that made those movies? Because, like, the idea of, like, a fake reality that was created for you, no spoilers intended,
right,
where you're part of this contrived reality, and then at some point you discover there's something not right, and then you start questioning it, and maybe you break out of it, and then you realize that people don't like it when you break the mold, and then your world kind of falls apart, but you also experience freedom. That's The Matrix, Tangled, Truman Show, Pleasantville, history, The Invention of Lying, Smallfoot. Like, there's so many movies that tell that same story. And after I realized that none of those filmmakers were Mormon, I'm like, wait a minute, maybe other people are experiencing this too. And then I watched Going Clear about Scientology.
Right.
And then I watched the Keith Raniere stuff about NXIVM. And I watched the Warren Jeff stuff about the FLDS Church and Jim Jones. And you start learning about cults and other high demanding religions. And then you watch just the stuff about evangelicals and like God forbid, about Jerry Falwell Jr. and Liberty University. And you're just like, whoa, there's cults everywhere. And it's not just religions. MLMs and businesses can be cults. The military can have cult characteristics. Corporations and family systems can have cult dynamics. And then you just realize what I realized was, and this has been my personal mantra for Mormon Stories for many years now, it's the Mormon story is the human story, and vice versa. And people, just like I learned more about Mormonism from Going Clear, the documentary on Scientology, than I ever did, listening to a Mormon podcast or watching a Mormon YouTube channel or reading a book about Mormonism, because I felt that on a spiritual, or I should say emotional level, because I saw it. I felt safe enough to see it in another tradition and then to tie it back to myself emotionally. And then I realized, whoa, that's what Mormon Stories can do to other people. It feels, oh, it's those weird, peculiar Mormons. They've got the Osmonds and Steve Young and David Arquette. They're kind of fun and they're clean, smiley, happy families. But then there's this weird dark side. What's going on here? And we're just interesting and entertaining enough for people to pay attention. And then they realize that they're not just seeing a quirky Mormon story. So many people are seeing their own stories within Mormon Stories. And it's been very gratifying to grow our influence and to help contribute just to the broader world. Because at the end of the day, we're all humans, right? It's not the Mormon family, it's the human family. And I'm proud to, when I was kicked out of the Mormon church, I felt sad that I was kicked out of the Mormon church, but I realized that I kind of joined the human race when I was kicked out of the Mormon church.
Right.
And that was a trade up as far as I was concerned.
Wonderful. So if the Mormon story is the human story, where are you? What chapter are you in now for your Mormon story, for your human story? If you're not a Mormon now, what would you call yourself? What are your beliefs at this point in a religious sense, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah. So, I don't. This is probably an answer you'll hear a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I've never been comfortable assuming the identity of atheist or agnostic.
Sure.
For several reasons. And I believe me, I get that there's a courageous element to facing the negative stereotypes and owning that title to make it more acceptable to bear those arrows so that others can come along later and feel comfortable if they want to identifying as well. Because obviously I'm sure it's still true that atheists have lower approval ratings than like child molesters. Like,
it's bad. It's still bad.
Never been elected to office, almost never in the United States. So I respect people who take that on. What I decided very early on, when I lost my Mormon faith, number one, no other church in the world. Every single church reminded me of the Mormon church once I scratched underneath the surface. So I thought about Episcopalians, they're progressive. Yeah, but they still have problems, and evangelicals and Presbyterians and Lutherans and Jews and Muslims, they've all got problems. And they all have the same formula of like, God talked to that other guy. And then we're supposed to believe the experience that some other guy had.
Right.
And by the way, almost all of those other guys wanted their money or wanted their wives or wanted sex or, or like taught genocide or bigotry or racism or sexism or homophobia, or the scriptures that they believed in were racist, sexist, homophobic, and often genocidal. So like, there was not a church. We investigated. We spent a couple of years attending every church we could.
Sure.
And finally, we realized that the Bible has as many problems, if not more problems, than the Book of Mormon. And I don't want to offend my Christian listeners, but just learn about historical criticism and biblical criticism and science, and you'll realize that the Bible's got major problems. So, but at the same time, I was committed to effectiveness, to reaching the most amount of people that I could. And you may as well tell a Mormon you're a child molester if you're going to tell them you're an atheist or an agnostic.
Right.
They will immediately shut you off. So I just decided for that reason, I was never going to identify as an atheist or agnostic. Also, I realized for me, and I know this won't sound clever to you, I'm sure you've heard it a million times, I don't identify as someone who's an A Easter Bunnyist or an A Santaist.
Sure.
Like there's no part of my identity, what I call myself, that has anything to do with all the things I don't believe.
Right.
And while I get the terms, I thought, is religion credible enough and worthy enough of taking up space in my identity? And to be honest, part of why I don't identify as an atheist or an agnostic is because I find the propositions so preposterous and so absurd and so unworthy
Mhm.
in a scientific, modern sort of era of sensibility that it's not worth any part of my identity.
Right. Right.
So for those reasons, and mostly just because I want to be super effective, I've literally never called myself an atheist or an agnostic.
Mhm.
I do believe that nobody knows. So I
Mhm.
think that literally meets the criteria of agnostic. If you don't believe that anyone knows anything about metaphysical supernatural stuff. So
Mhm.
I think everybody's an agnostic.
Mhm.
If you look at now, there are people that don't know they're agnostic,
Right.
but most smart, thoughtful people will acknowledge that, like, well, they think their beliefs are true, but they
Mhm.
could be wrong. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
And that they don't know for sure. Those zealots who say they know, they're the scary. In my mind, they're the most dangerous people of all.
Right.
So anyway, you can see where I stand with agnosticism,
Sure.
and I guess I've already told you my approach to not labeling myself as an atheist.
No, that is a very practical approach, and I find the labels are used lots of different ways. Just to know where I'm coming from, I do call myself an atheist, but it's because the way that I find as we're moving through a maturing society that understands that there's subtlety to these sorts of questions, the way that I find it's most commonly defined is, are you convinced that there's a God? Do you believe that there's a God? And if you don't say yes to that, then you lack a belief in God, and that's the A part of the theist. So it's not anything other than that. Am I convinced there's not a God? No. It's sort of like from the legal perspective. We find people not guilty. We don't find them innocent. I find God not guilty of existing. I don't find him innocent of existing. I can't prove or say that there is no God. I can just say that of the versions of God that people have presented to me so far, I have not been presented with sufficient evidence. Therefore, I don't believe. And I totally agree with you regarding the A Easter Bunnyist and the A Loch Ness Monsterist. Right? That's another issue. I think the reason some people choose to go ahead and take on the label, though, is we don't have Easter Bunnyists in Congress saying we don't have to investigate climate change because God promised he would never flood the earth again. It's sort of a common trope that you get in the atheist community is, oh, why do you care so much? If you don't believe, why do you care? Well, we care, and we take on the name because there are people not just off in their corner and saying, I believe this personally, right? I have many, many religious friends. They have their own faiths. We have lots of interesting discussions. But the minute that somebody says, not only do I have these beliefs, but that in belief includes the fact that there is a God and that I understand what that God wants, and he wants me to do something, that's when we start running into danger, and then those people get elected, and we see what we're seeing in the world today. So I totally am on board with your way of thinking that yes, 100%, if you especially in this country, if you come out and say I'm an anythingist regarding religion, people are going to shut down needlessly because they've been taught that atheism or agnosticism or any sort of disbelief or skepticism even is a bad word. I even heard people call in and tell me that I had people call in and tell me that I was a atheist Muslim.
Hmm.
They don't even understand what the word means. It's like communist now, that in the political circles, like if I disagree with you, I'm going to call you a communist. If I think you're a bad person, I'm going to call you an atheist. The word has almost lost meaning other than to mean I'm on the wrong team. So I agree. I don't bring it up except for example, when I do a podcast. And if you're in the mission of helping people who are struggling with religion, bringing any sort of label to a belief system, if the question even comes up when they're talking to you, can really shut people down. I've seen it happen. As soon as you say, like when I was early sort of realizing I was an atheist, most atheists will go through a angry atheist phase. There's probably an angry Mormon phase, ex-Mormon phase too, where my anger came from, I really didn't care until I saw people doing things in the world, like telling me that I couldn't play Dungeons and Dragons because it was demonic, or passing laws, or saying that we don't need to research AIDS because gay people are bringing this on God's wrath. And that's when I'm like, okay, I must be missing something. Like in all my little schoolings and Sunday school tales, I didn't hear that part of the Bible. So let me go research it. And then once you go research it and you realize it's all BS as far as like what the politicians are saying is not scriptural or not historical, you get very angry. You're like, you're being fooled. We're all being fooled. I would have sworn that there's got to be something more that has convinced all these people are right. Nope. It turns out that a lot of people haven't even read their Bibles. They listen to their preachers, they listen to their politicians, and they just do what they say. So that's where I come from. That's sort of what really inspired me to start being sort of a vocal activist, because I went through that angry phase for a couple of years, and then I came into where I am now, which is I just want to talk to people. I find the stories fascinating, and I want to understand how religion is being used to create political violence, try to take over governments, things like that. When all the evidence is that if people actually go and read their scriptures, if people really dive into the claims of their religion, they moderate their views. They at least moderate their views, if not abandon them.
Yeah,
And that's sort of the goal.
And I really respect that approach, secular humanism, all those types of movements I really respect.
Mm-hmm.
I will add one last final thing, just as a little bone for my Christians and believers out there. I love the idea of mystery. I love the idea of wonder.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the idea of epistemic humility, which is like, I don't know for sure anything. I don't know anything for sure. And I know that there are plenty of atheists and agnostics that are humble. In fact, atheism and agnosticism is a move for many towards humility.
Right.
But we all know the insufferable atheists out there that they're more zealous as missionaries than they were as believers.
Right.
And they want to convert, and they're absolutely certain that there's no God, even though I know that's a bit of a canard. And I just like the idea of saying, maybe there's some power out there. Maybe there's some force. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's some organizing thing, or maybe who knows? Small chance there's life after, but like, would I like to keep living on? Sure. So if I die and find out there's an afterlife, am I going to like be bummed? I'm going to be like, no. So, I mean, I do like the idea. One of the reasons I also don't identify as atheist or agnostic is because I like staying open, and who knows, maybe some of this stuff, small chance, but maybe some of this stuff is true, or it's true in a way that we don't fully understand.
Right.
And so I'm just going to remain open. And honestly, I think a lot of Jesus's teachings, golden rule stuff, are super legit and super valid. And I think religions often do a good job of creating meaning, identity, purpose, community, friends, and so like I'm at least a secular Christian in many ways, not all the ways, but in many ways. I think if more of us did a better job of listening to Jesus and following some of his core teachings, the world would be better off. That's what I think.
I agree. I agree. The New Testament is written almost as a Band-Aid over the character of God in the Old Testament, right? Wrath and vengeance and genocide in the Old Testament, and then I told you before I'm doing a long series on faith healing. If Jesus is portrayed as anything in the New Testament, he is a healer. He is a doctor. He is about medicine. He is the first time in the Bible that he says, don't treat children as property. Suffer the young children, right? Put up with them, because before then, kids were property. You could kill them. They were girls were a hassle. Let's bury them in the pit. Jesus is the one who comes along in the character of Jesus, at least, and says, suffer the young children, put up with them. He heals left and right. He makes people have better lives. And that's, I think there's many, many, many Christians that hear that message and say, I can get behind that, and I'm going to support it. And that leads to a very rewarding community, a very rewarding sort of spiritual journey for them. Although I don't, spiritual is a very wishy-washy word, but it does something for them in maybe finding their place in the universe or finding a purpose, right? So again, to reference the Book of Mormon, it's a love letter to religion from somebody who doesn't believe. Like, there are a lot of good things out there. So I totally agree with you. You need to find out what you're comfortable. And to me, I don't care about the labels as much as having conversations where we sort of define terms on our own, because no two atheists are alike. I'm sure no two Mormons are alike. No two agnostics are alike. You have to find out where people stand and meet them on their own ground in order to have a conversation and then decide if you guys can identify politely where you agree and where you disagree. And then where you disagree, decide, well, how do we figure this out? What method do we have as humans to figure out, am I right? Are you right? Are neither of us right? And we can do that in a loving way, a polite way, an investigatory way. And we don't need labels to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it.
All right.
Well, this is really good stuff. And I'm really glad to learn that you're out there. I've just started to watch Matt Dillahunty, and I think he's smart. I need to check out the Atheist Experience as well. Sure. And there's just, we as ex-Mormons need to get out of our little bubbles and bubbles inside bubbles, and learn more about the big beautiful secular world out there, honestly.
Right. Yeah. And I will say, I'm sure the Atheist Experience would love to have you on a guest if you'd like. The Atheist Experience show is a call-in show. People will call in and we ask them, what do you believe and why? And then we talk about the whys. And typically it will be a discussion of, well, what reasoning are you using to get there? And our main goal, of course, is to spread the positive image of atheism, that, hey, we aren't the bad guys you've been told about. We're just people that haven't been convinced yet. I'll put the yet on there. I haven't been convinced yet, right? I may be presented with evidence. But we don't want people to become extremists, right? If we can have conversations where we point out flaws in their logic and ask them to go back and do more reading or whatever, they will moderate their views again. And that's sort of my theme. If we all moderate our views a little bit, we're less likely to have, the Handmaid's Tale become a reality. That's what we're worried about. So, I know we're way over time. I really appreciate all the time that you've given me. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring up? For example, where can people find you online? What's the best place to go and see your work and start participating in your Mormon Stories podcast?
Yeah, I think the best place to probably have the Mormon Stories experience is on YouTube. We do make some money off of the ads. Of course, if you have YouTube Premium, you get to skip the ads. So that's what I recommend is $10 a month, get YouTube Premium, and then watch us there. And if you have YouTube Premium and you just want to listen, let's say you watch for an hour and then you want to just take it on your jog, YouTube Premium allows you to listen even while your iPod is in, lock screen mode or whatever.
Sure.
So I would say number one way for us is through YouTube. We're also available on Spotify. We're also available on Apple Podcasts. That's where we started, is on iTunes, that became Apple Podcasts. And then we have a Facebook page that has over 100,000 followers. We do release our interviews on Facebook. We have to break them up into chunks.
Right.
We also have a TikTok channel where we release shorts for Mormon Stories. You can watch little 1 to 2 minute clips. We've got like 270 or 260,000 subscribers on TikTok at this point. Wow. It's probably our largest platform in terms of subscribers. It might be going away. We've got 50,000 followers on Instagram. We also release our shorts as reels on Instagram. We don't do much on TikTok. So those are the different ways you can check us out. And then we are donor supported. So if any of you like what we do and want to see it continue, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're transparent in our finances. We feel like we run the organization transparently and ethically. And if you go to mormonstories.org and click on the donate button, you can become a monthly donor. And that's the way to financially support what we do.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I will give a shout out. It's not my organization. I merely am one of their hosts, but the Atheist Community of Austin is a similar situation. They too are a 501c3 organization with a board of directors that is managing them. And they are they produce lots of different shows: The Atheist Experience, Talk Heathen, Truth Wanted, the nonprofits. There's a bunch of call-in shows and some just hot topic discussion shows that have this mission of trying to get people talking about what they believe and why, and then try to enforce the separation of church and state. And then, of course, there's my podcast. You can find me on as the Cross Examiner podcast on any podcasting platform, or you can just go to my website at thecrossexaminer.net is my my podcast, because apparently crossexaminer.com was taken for, I don't know, they wanted $50,000 for it. I'm not going to do that. So, yeah, exactly. John, it's been an absolute thrill talking to you. You've really educated me, and you've given me a lot of things to think about. And more than anything, I think you've given me hope. I got to admit that looking at the rise of things like QAnon and radical political organizations that are trying to take over the government and do really bad things in the name of religion or by exploiting people's religious beliefs really is stressing and depressing. But hearing your story and hearing how you help other people and showing that the internet, in fact, can be a tool for good. It's not all just misleading memes. It's actually deep dive conversations that get into the nitty gritty. And that has helped people sort of moderate their views, come out of a religion that they weren't happy in. That's really encouraging. So thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you, Graham. It's so nice to meet you. It's so nice to learn about your podcast and all of your efforts as well. You're a professional interviewer. You ask great questions, and I'm honored that you would spend the time to learn about my story, to share it with your audience. And I really do encourage my audience to check out both your podcast and the Atheist Experience if you're looking for that type of stuff. But let's keep collaborating. We need more cross culture collaborations, and so let's do a little bit more.
I agree 100%. I look forward to chatting with you anytime you want, and in the future, I will make sure to send people over. I will say, for my audience, I know that a lot of you like my sort of lengthy deep dive stories. John's stories on Mormon stories is 10 times what I do. He really gets into the nitty gritty. He really takes the time to let you get to know the person he's interviewing or the topic he's doing. So I know my audience would love to go over and listen to your content as well, because it's drawn me in. It's all I listened to for the last several weeks since I discovered what you do.
Well, thank you. All right. Thanks so much. And y'all take care.
Bye-bye.
And we'll hope to see you again soon. Thanks, Graham.
Thanks.